You may have noticed there's been quite a bit of democracy around the world at the moment, particularly with elections in the Northern Hemisphere, and some quite significant changes, some perhaps more unexpected than others. But when it comes to democracy, looking at the issue of what popularism is, and it's not necessarily what you think it is. It's not necessarily the one with the most votes. Joining us on the program now from the Maxim Insitute, Josiah Brown. Kia ora, good morning. Thanks for your time today.
Good morning.
There's a lot of talk about popularist politicians. From my sense of how the word is used, it's not usually a compliment. Would that be fair?
No, it's not usually a compliment. And I think whenever we're engaging with media or political commentary around sort of present day debates, we should really be analysing the way in which language is employed and what lies behind it. So when populist is used, really, I have in my mind initially skinhead, a neo-Nazi, white supremacist, someone who is really out there to go after minorities, who really has a sense of superiority. So, yeah, certainly a pejorative term.
It's certainly a twisting of the term, because you'd think a popularist is, in some ways, should be at the heart of democracy. Those who are most popular get the most votes, and that's the way democracy works. If you don't like that, go somewhere where they have a totalitarian government, which is not necessarily popularist, but certainly powerful. But that's not the way in which the term works. You can be popularist, but also a minority.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the interesting things. It's very difficult to distinguish between populist politics and regular politics, because isn't all politics about representing the will of the people? And if you're vying for people's votes, obviously you need to appeal to them. So, what's the difference? This is not coming from my authority. This is not my definition. Google, the all-knowing, says that populism is a political approach that strives to appeal to ordinary people who feel that their concerns are disregarded by established elite groups. Yeah. So that's the definition that Google gives. Winston Peters also has his own definition, and he's probably our example of a populist leader. Mm-hmm. He says populism means that you're talking to the ordinary people and you're placing their views far higher than the beltway and the paparazzi, or dare I say, the bureaucracy. So there again, you have quite nicely encapsulated this idea that the populist cares about the voice of the people, the voice of those who are unheard by those in the media and government, academia, etc., who feel that they're not represented in some way. And so, of course, there's an element where minority politics is involved.
And hey, honestly, Nazi skinheads are people too. Fortunately, they're not a minority in our country. However, they do get the right to vote. We're just wanting to make that clear, and we celebrate the fact that even people that we disagree with get the right to vote. That's how democracy works. Interesting, we take Winston Peters as an example. I think he might even describe himself as a popularist politician, in that he represents he's anti-establishment in some ways. He's, not quite a revolutionary, but he's countercultural and represents people with a countercultural point of view. Would that be another way of defining it, Josiah?
Yeah, and I think you're touching on this idea of anti-establishment, or maybe more specifically anti-elite. Yeah. And so I think that's something that you see populists have in common, either on the left or on the right. Really, they're speaking to a group of people who consider themselves to be ordinary, everyday sorts of citizens, and says the people who hold power aren't listening to you. In fact, in some cases, they even despise you. And the only way we're going to fix this problem is if you vote me in to deal with the issue. Yeah, that's really what it comes down to.
And this is one of the great things about democracy, I suppose, is that it's not just the influential, it's not just the powerful, it's not just the people who have money and access to politicians who get to have a say in a representative democracy. All of us get to have our say, and perhaps it is a warning light to not just here in New Zealand but other parts of the world. If you ignore the plight of people who perhaps aren't influential, then at some point there's going to be a pushback, right?
Totally. And I think there's a real danger that the populist leader who arises is actually an unsavory figure. Yeah. In Europe at the moment, there's a lot of talk about the far-right swing. Note that you'll never hear anyone talk about right-wing politics in Europe, or at least not what I've come across. It's always far-right. Yeah. I don't know what that means. But there is the danger that within those parties, there are unsavory characters, even though the parties themselves may be representing ordinary, everyday concerns of people who do want to, say, have conversations about immigration. Douglas Murray notes in his book, The Strange Death of Europe, that immigration was one of those topics that politicians sort of ring-fenced and said, this is not an area you can go. We can't speak about this. So when politicians do arise and go, actually, this is something I want to speak about because this is important, people will flock to them. So really the danger lies when a popular leader becomes increasingly so to the point where they can start doing things with a constitution. And I think President Nayib Bukele of El Salvador, he's a great example of that, both positively and negatively. So to lay it out for people who are listening, the Constitution says in El Salvador that you can't have 2 consecutive terms. Okay. Bukele was elected and stayed in power because he oversaw a massive crackdown on gangs that saw the murder rate plummet, and now El Salvador went from being one of the most dangerous places in South America to now one of the safest. Yeah. So they had their elections, and he got an overwhelming majority. 83% of voters voted for him. The issue being that, of course, this is now his second consecutive term. So how does that work? He's popular on the one hand because he's done a lot of good and has appealed to the concerns of everyday people who are concerned about crime and the way that that's affecting their ability to live their lives, to do business, to be safe, etc. But on the other hand, well, this is what do you do with this in the Constitution? So the court ruled, which was filled with his supporters, that actually if he just stepped down for a time, he could then return and so satisfy the requirements of the Constitution. So he stepped down, I think it was early this year, and he was sworn in June. So he steps down, but really, in essence, his president's his role is unconstitutional, you might say.
But hey, if anywhere needs to have constitutional checks and balance against the abuse of power, it's probably a place like El Salvador, which has certainly seen some excesses and certainly has some negative influences controlling society behind the scenes. So certainly get that from that point of view. I suppose the other current example of populist politics would be Donald Trump. And certainly a interesting, if not bizarre, situation heating up in the state as they head towards their election in November. I suppose the thing with populists, though, once you've been in power, are you still populist? Or do you become part of the bureaucracy, part of the machine? That you can only be populist as an outsider. It's difficult to be in government and still hold that populist mantle. What do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you touch on it correctly. I guess the question becomes, do you still have political enemies who you can point at and go, well, these people still hold power, they're still a threat, and I'm the only one who can fix it. So in that sense, I think, Donald Trump can still claim mantle of populist even as president if he wins, which to my thinking, it seems quite likely that he will. But who knows? Anything can happen. It's politics.
Certainly seems to be the way it's tracking. And I think perhaps an extra nudge from Donald Trump's style of politics, because he's not the incumbent. He's the comeback kid, as it were, that he's pushing against the establishment and against the various conspiracy theories that denied him a victory last time. That certainly gives a bit of momentum to a populist message, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think particularly within the US context, it's incredibly divided. And you may even start to see a little bit of it here. And I'm thinking of the Green Party specifically. They've had a shocking year in terms of scandals. But if you look at the polls, their support hasn't wavered. And so I think what's interesting there is that there's an element of ideology that people sort of hold to and go, well, irrespective of the dramas within the party, these people represent what I think, and so they're going to get my vote anyway. Yeah. And I think that's kind of what we see in the States. You might not like Trump, but you may far prefer him to the alternative. And so he'll get your vote, even if you actually despise the guy.
Now, this particular conversation, well, you've written an article on this topic. This is going to be posted on the Maxim website a little bit later this week. Certainly some food for thought in that regard. Josiah, thank you for the work you do. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Andrew.
Hey, thanks very much for joining us in the Rhema studio. Thanks very much for watching the interview. It's kind of nice to have an audience, actually. And if you did like what you watched, then do give us a like, do give us the thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more interviews like that one, or perhaps even better, subscribe and those interviews will come straight to you. Don't forget to turn on your notifications, and we'll see you in the next one. Cheers.